Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to our event, Rising to Our Responsibility, a forum for school leaders to address racial violence and anti-Blackness in Michigan schools. My name is Terah Venzant Chambers. I am a professor of educational leadership in the College of Education at Michigan State. I also serve as the Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion. I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator tonight, but I will also juggle that role with serving on the panel with a few of my esteemed MSU colleagues. I'll introduce them in just a minute, but I want to begin by sharing a little intention behind this session. The events that unfolded in the wake of George Floyd's murder in my home state of Minnesota have awakened in many a new understanding of and willingness to learn about the role of racism in schools. Conversations have started in many venues in traditional media, but particularly social media. In fact, here in mid-Michigan, a local superintendent made remarks on social media where he blamed Mr. Floyd for what happened to him. And understandably, the community erupted in a firestorm. The superintendent was terminated and also resigned from a state level leadership office. And all of these things were the right moves, but that's not the whole story. And so this forum came out of three important truths related to all of this. The first truth is that the important part of the story of this local superintendent isn't whether or not he is a racist. If that were the issue alone, his termination would solve the problem. Actually, last Friday, I attended a virtual school board meeting in the district that lasted more than 7 hours, where literally hundreds of community members shared their historically long-standing experiences with racism in the district. Their stories revealed the systemic nature of these events that have been happening there and have been happening for some time. So in some ways, it would be easier if this were just a story about a racist superintendent. That would make this more straightforward in some ways, but the issue is much more insidious and ingrained in the fabric of our society. Critical race scholars and leading Black historians and sociologists have long noted the role that institutions like schools play in maintaining white supremacy. Educators are called on now to grapple with those realities. The second truth is that MSU has some responsibility here too. The superintendent I'm talking about is a graduate of one of our doctoral programs, and several other administrators and teachers from that district have earned degrees at MSU. Indeed, our teacher and leadership preparation programs train a great deal of our state's teachers and school leaders. As such, we have a responsibility to lead conversations about what's happening and ensure that teachers and leaders who leave our programs are prepared to respond to these challenges regardless of the context in which they serve. And even after they leave, the events of the last few weeks remind us that our duty to them and to the children of the state of Michigan does not end. The final truth is that the many heartbreaking stories I listened to on Friday could have come from any number of districts in our state. That's why I'm not naming the district, though it will be easy enough for you to learn that information if you're interested, if you just do a little Google search. But I'm not sharing the district name because it's not relevant to our conversation. It's not important. The important question is, if it were your district under the microscope, if we asked Black families in your schools to share their experiences, what would they reveal about the kind of culture that you've created and cultivated in your district? This forum is not about casting blame. It is about taking responsibility. And while for many, awareness of these issues is really just dawning now, those of us on the panel have been studying systemic racism throughout our careers. So on that note, let me move to introducing our panelists. First, Dr. Dorinda Carter-Andrews is the chairperson for the Department of Teacher Education, the first Black woman to serve in that role. So proud. She is also a professor of race, culture, and equity. Her research is broadly focused on racial justice and educational equity. She examines these topics by illuminating voices of youth and adults who have been historically and traditionally marginalized in schools and society. Dorinda has worked with school leaders and teachers across the state and throughout the country to implement culturally responsive and relevant education for students of color. She is co-editor of the Journal of Teacher Education, and she has given 2 TEDx talks, one called The Consciousness Gap in Education, the other called Teach Kids to Be Eagles. I recommend both of them. Her most recent piece for school leaders was published just last Tuesday in Ed Week, providing considerations for addressing community members during this ongoing anti-Black racial violence. She is also a mother to 3 wonderful girls who all give me hope for what our next generation will bring to the world. Second, Dr. Alyssa Hadley Dunn. Dr. Dunn is an associate professor of teacher education in the College of Education at MSU. She is also a former high school English teacher, and she now researches urban education and the sociocultural and political context of urban schools with a focus on issues of race, justice, and equity. She is currently working on her third book based on interviews with teachers around the country about how educators make pedagogical decisions on days after major events, tragedies, or instances of injustice. As a public scholar, Dr. Dunn's work has been featured on the Huffington Post, CNN, National Public Radio, as well as education blogs and podcasts. She is also senior associate editor of the journal Multicultural Perspectives and the mother of 2 young children. She is kind enough to share beautiful and often hilarious stories of those 2 boys. I am inspired by her intentional work with them to understand racial injustice even at young ages. Next is Dr. Jada Phelps-Moultrie. Dr. Phelps-Moultrie is an assistant professor of K-12 educational administration in the College of Education at Michigan State. Her scholarship includes family engagement, culturally responsive leadership, and equity in education. She takes an intersectional approach to exploring families and communities and their educational pursuits, extending to online education. She often examines the intersection of race and racism with other forms of oppression. In that aim, she includes how leaders support or detract family and community pursuits. Dr. Phelps-Moultrie inspires me with her commitment to remaining engaged with families. She can always be counted on to show up in support of Black community. She is also raising 3 incredible humans, although I'm not sure how she pulls it all off sometimes. I introduced myself already, but I'll just add that in addition to my roles in the College of Education, I also am Vice President of the East Lansing School Board. I'm not speaking officially in that capacity tonight, but I want to mention it because it's an important part of who I am and the responsibility that I shoulder in the broader community to connect the research and teaching that I do and my work at MSU with the broader community. My broad research interests include post-Brown K-12 education policy and urban education leadership, but really I'm interested in what it costs Black and Latinx students to pursue academic success in schools where expectations for what students should dress like, behave like, speak like are normed on dominant white standards. I call this racial opportunity cost. And while racial opportunity cost is probably most pronounced in suburban districts like the one I graduated from outside St. Paul, Minnesota, these are challenges that students in rural and urban schools face too. I also have a son, Langston, who is entering the 4th grade. Watching him navigate the world gives me a renewed purpose for the work that I do. So in addition to being 4 amazing race and equity scholars, we are also mothers. We are all deeply connected to and invested in our local schools. And this is not just what we do, this is who we are. And I'm proud to serve on this panel with them. So let me just give a few brief points about how our time together will be spent. I have 3 questions that I would like to talk through with our panelists, which will take about half of our time. In the second half of the forum, we will move into Q&A. We were able to solicit questions in advance of this event, and actually we received many, many more questions than we will be able to specifically answer in the time that we have. So the good thing is that many of the questions address topics that we'll likely cover already tonight. And I also hope that we'll be able to take a few live questions. It just depends on how our time together goes. And then finally, just a few notes about technology. When you entered the Zoom webinar, you were automatically muted and your cameras were turned off. You can only see the panelists, so don't worry if you don't see yourself. If you would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A feature, not the chat. We've left the chat open to allow you to have some engagement with each other, but it will be hard for the panelists to follow what's happening in the chat. So please feel free to share your thoughts and each other as the conversation unfolds. But if you want to ask a question of the panel, please use the Q&A, not the chat. We also have Jen Brown helping us monitor these spaces. Our hope is that this process reduces the chance for Zoom bombing that sometimes happens in these kinds of large online forums, but please know that if the chat gets co-opted, we may have to disable that feature, but we'll be able to continue with the panel. The good news is that we expect to host a series of these sessions, which all will be open to the public. If you would like to receive information directly about these sessions, you can use the Submit Questions link on the event page for this forum. There's an option to submit your email address to get on our mailing list. Okay, so without further ado, let's move into the first question. The events that have been happening in the wake of Mr. Floyd's murder did not just come out of thin air. What is important for school leaders to understand about the history and the context of these protests that are happening now in Michigan and throughout the world? Dr. Carter-Andrews, why don't we start with you for this question, and then the rest of us can kind of chime in from there.
Sure, thanks, Terah.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'd start by saying, for one, we all need to understand that protests and resistance movements have always been a part of the fabric of American life. So they've always been a part of justice projects for Black humanity, freedom, and joy in this land. And so while this moment places a laser focus on state-sanctioned police brutality against Black bodies, it's not only about the brutal murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others. Vulnerability to policing has been a way of life for Black folks in the US for centuries. So we can look to the structure of, for example, slave patrols in the 1800s as an early form of policing Black life. Organized policing was one of the many forms of social control imposed on enslaved Africans throughout the South. I would say schooling is no different. You can consider the life-threatening consequences of reading and writing for Black people pre-emancipation. That's a form of social control and organized policing. And post-emancipation, we have many examples across time of organized policing and social control of Black children in schools. So this moment is partly, I would say, about education as a human and civil right. And that's a mantra that has always been germane to the existence of Black peoples in this country. So when you consider the history of Black education, protests and resistance movements have centered access to the same material conditions and resources that many white and economically advantaged children have. So school leaders really need to understand that protesting and resisting is foundational to the struggle for equality, equity, and liberation of Black folks and other oppressed people. It's the practice of our freedom. So these protests are a response to the suppression of a people's freedom and liberation. And I would just say any schooling project that aims to educate Black children and does not provide the material conditions and resources for affirming their humanity, sustaining their joy, and cultivating their brilliance inherently has an anti-Black agenda, even if it wasn't intended to. So one of the things school leaders must do, along with their administrative teams and school boards, is to ask themselves, what are the various ways that Black bodies are policed in our buildings right now, and how do we demolish those structures, systems, and practices?
Absolutely, Dr. Carter-Andrews. Thank you so much. Dr. Phelps-Moultrie, Dr. Dunn, either of you like to make a comment?
Jada, you're muted.
I was saying, go ahead, Alyssa. Go ahead. Okay. No, I really do think you summed it up quite well, Dorinda. One of the things that I have heard that has resonated with me, just as a scholar focused on Black families, is the narrative around being sick and tired of having to educate their children around while we're out in the streets at this particular point in time. That social control that you talked about, I think that has been part of historically Black families since plantation days, where Black families have had to coach their children around what it means to be Black in America and how you have to go about policing yourself. And that spills over into schools as well. Matter of fact, it's so prevalent that Wilma King, she wrote a book called Stolen Childhood, and she has considered, based on what we know about Black children during enslavement, that they did have essentially a stolen childhood, but that's being recreated right now. There's so much data around how Black families have had to have the talk with their children and what that means. And, you know, you have to have that talk with your children when they go into school. And so I just think that you just hit the nail on the head with your response. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Chambers for the invitation and to welcome everyone. I'm glad to be here on this panel with these wonderful friends and colleagues. And I just want to start by acknowledging my role on this panel and in this movement, which I think is to amplify the voices and experiences of my Black colleagues, students, and community members. I identify as a white cisgender woman, and I'm privileged to have learned about racism from books and friends and stories rather than to have experienced it myself. And so that's why I wrestled with this decision even to be on this panel when Dr. Chambers invited me, and why I wrestle with my position every day, because I'm a teacher educator who teaches about equity and justice, which means that my job only exists because of oppression. And indeed, we all work at an institution, right, that calls itself a land-grant university, but exists on stolen land. So I see my role here again as amplifying the voices of others as I work to deconstruct and decenter whiteness and white supremacy in individuals, institutions, and ideologies. I think my colleagues have already shared so much wisdom. So I'll just reinforce one thing for those in the audience who identify as white. As Dr. Carter Andrews said, the injustice is not new. The protests are not new. And if it feels new to you, then that's your privilege at work. I don't think that we could have gotten 900 people to register for a webinar on this topic 2 years ago or 4 or 6 years ago. But white people and police were murdering Black people then too. And people were protesting then too. So this means that what we as school leaders and teachers need to be asking ourselves as white folks is first and foremost, where the hell have we been? We have to figure that out before we can figure out where we're going. And we must listen to the voices of Black scholars, students, and community activists to inform that path forward. So I'm glad that we're here now, and I hope that this is the beginning of what should have happened long ago.
Thanks, Alyssa. I'm going to have to hold myself back from commenting too much, but just one thing that I want to mention is that these dominant narratives about the history of protest often leave out the unpleasant parts, the parts that don't fit neatly in history books, the toll that was taken by the Black community for every inch of ground that was gained. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just share one example from the desegregation movement, but those of you who know me know that I often go off on history tangents, so I'm going to try to tamp that down. But we hail the end of state-sanctioned segregated schools and the Jim Crow law that supported them, that was brought about by the Brown decision, but we don't talk about the entire generation of Black teachers who were fired basically overnight because the white community couldn't be expected to send their children to school with Black students and learn from Black teachers too. We don't talk about the Black administrators who also lost their jobs, who were demoted from principal to assistant principal, or went from being principal of the high school to the assistant principal at the middle school, or principal of an elementary school. So these protests that are happening now also stem from a bone deep weariness of half steps and compromises, of too little too late, right? People are tired, and it's understandable that they're tired, right? So, okay, I'm gonna calm down.
And Dr. Chambers, let me just say, first of all, snap to that, right? Because that's the gaslighting around the absence of Black teachers in teaching,
Yes.
right? We've been gaslighted to believe that there's this scarcity, but people don't talk about the push out. And I would argue that that push out of Black teachers and administrators is another form of social control and policing Black education. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So let's move to the second question. Dr. Dunn, why don't we start with you on this one? What are some missteps that school leaders should avoid? What are particularly, on the other hand, particularly helpful action steps for school leaders to consider? Why don't you get us started, and then the rest of us can kind of comment.
Okay, thank you. So I'll start with the missteps. And in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on steps that involve teachers. And a lot of my response to this question is based on conversations that I've had with educators over the last 2 years while working on the project that Dr. Chambers mentioned at the beginning about teaching on days after major events and injustices. And it's also based on hearing from my former students, now teachers, and colleagues from around the country who have been trying to figure out what to do these past few weeks and how to do it. And education leaders in the audience, these are your teachers. They are from your school, your district, and your state, and they are worried and afraid, and they are waiting for you to help them take the lead. So I think misstep 1 is not saying something about what's happening. This makes your teachers worried because they don't know where you stand, and your silence directly harms your Black teachers and other teachers of color. If teachers don't know that you support them now, then how can they trust you to support them at any time? Misstep 2, I think, is related to that. Telling your teachers not to say anything to their students or to be neutral. There is no neutral here. There is no middle ground, as author Tyree Jones writes. Your teachers cannot be neutral about this, and you cannot ask them to be. It dehumanizes them, and it dehumanizes their students. And so many of the teachers that I talk with are worried about administrative and parental pushback. And so as school leaders, we have to assure them that they can talk with their students about what's happening, that you can provide them resources if they have questions, and that you will also be speaking to families and students, because they can't do this in isolation. James Baldwin wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And so for both the teachers and the administrators listening, it's time to face it. I think misstep 3 is thinking that there are only certain ages, grade levels, or demographics where these issues can be addressed. We know that children as young as 2 and 3 can identify racial categories and are forming opinions about race. So you can't tell me that your 3rd graders or middle schoolers or high schools can't talk about this, that they're not mature enough to do so. And this also privileges white innocence over Black experiences. Because as Jada said earlier, parents of Black children can't wait to have this conversation, and we have to support that in our schools. We have to remember that eradicating white supremacy and anti-Blackness is the work of the people who created it, white people. We can't say that these discussions don't matter or can't happen because we work or teach in all white schools, and indeed they matter deeply. And finally, misstep 4, I think, is looking for and implementing short-term, quick fix solutions to long-term systemic inequities and injustices. These solutions in public education today often look like rubrics and lists, and I love lists as much as the next person, and I share them often. I get asked for them very often, I think we all do. Lists of children's books and adult books, checklists of actions, toolkits for teachers. But we have to remember that lists are only the beginning. We can't just read it a book and call it a day. We can't give teachers a toolkit or a one-time PD and think that's enough. So for white teachers and leaders, we must engage in deep self-reflection about why we feel the need for checklists and quick fixes in the first place. And then we have to do something about that. We can't checklist our way to ending our own white supremacy. We can't book club our way to equity, and we can't toolkit our way to racial justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Carter-Andrews or Dr. Phelps-Moultrie, either of you want to chime in here?
No, I think she said it well. I'm snapping again, so I don't have anything to add. Thank you, Alyssa.
Dr. Phelps-Moultrie? She's saying no? Okay. Well, I'll combine a misstep with a helpful action item maybe. I think the misstep is waiting for Black and Brown communities to dictate what to do, or think that because there aren't many Black teachers or administrators that there are limits to what the next steps are. This just isn't true. So this is like an action step. So this is an action step. Don't wait. Don't fall back on an excuse of wanting to wait to listen to Black community members to take action. Yes, listening is important, but it's not a way station to action, right? I see too many white school leaders waiting for Black people to tell them what to do. Guess what? We already have told you. This information may be new to you, but I promise that everything that you're looking for already exists. So you need to catch up, right? I mean that in a spirit of love, right? You need to get caught up, right? So do some reading, participate in forums like this one. You're already taking action steps. This is great. But I promise you that you'll get the information that you need to move forward. Listen, yes. Listen and act, right? Listen and act. Okay, third question. I have to moderate, Terah, not panel. Okay, so thank you, everyone. So the final prepared question is, what are your hopes and dreams for Michigan schools as a result of these protests? Dr. Phelps-Moultrie, I'd be thrilled if you would start us out this time.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. One that I thought warranted consideration based on what's at the heart of these global protests, and then how Michigan schools are implicated. Moreover, because you asked about my hope and dreams, I also had to kind of bridge what I have observed from the protests and Michigan schools in general. So I'll start directly with answering the question and breaking down why. Just given these protests, my ultimate hope for and dreams for Michigan schools, whether it's from public, private to charter, is to serve as a model for creating educational spaces that has rid itself of anti-Blackness and actively castigates any instance of such conduct from superintendent to pupil. That way, schools can begin to serve Black children toward achieving their highest potential that they define for themselves. And my hope is that this pursuit is in tandem with other movements across those who are also living and schooling in fear. So I think many do not realize the extent Black and brown people live in fear, even in schools, because of racism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness. It's so, like I said before, it was so prevalent that Black families have been known to remove their children from schools. And that phenomenon, we've named it, called racial protectionism, and it has some distinct ties as to why the percentage of Black homeschooling families have nearly doubled in the last decade. But some instances that we can attribute to anti-Blackness in Michigan schools that we can begin to rid ourselves of, and we've already kind of said it, so I'm gonna just kind of restate it, but when Black children experience criminalization in schools, there's large-scale data over the years that have revealed time and time again that Black students are disproportionately disciplined from being sentenced to ISS, to even receiving corporal punishment, which is still on the books in Michigan, unfortunately. In Michigan alone, Black students are 5 times more likely to be hit by school adults than by adults than whites. And then even further, we see boys and particularly students with disabilities, Black boys and students with disabilities who are disproportionately disciplined in K-12 public schools altogether. So we have that element going on. And then we also have another element where we see anti-Blackness and who gets to be part of, advanced placement and gifted and talented classes. So even though last year Michigan praised itself for having the most students participate in AP exams, only 4% were Black students, 6% were Hispanic students, but 71% were white. Clearly, this is a form of receivement gap. So how do we get to this hope where Black children can reach their highest potential? First, I think we need to start by being intersectional and recognizing that Black students come to us more than just being Black students. There are Black girls, there are transgender students who are Black, and we have to begin kind of looking at the intersections on how they're being served and how they're not being served. And then just kind of thinking through the protests, there's an enormous amount of silence around Breonna Taylor, her death, around Tony McDade, his death, a transgendered man shot and killed by police in Tallahassee. So the intersectional piece is so needed. But at the same time, we also must hire more Black teachers and teachers of color in general, which we've already spent some time here, but in Michigan alone, we have a student population around 18%, but only 6% of teachers in the ranks are Black. And that's true of Hispanic students as well. Matter of fact, it's even less. It's 1% of teachers are Hispanic in the state of Michigan. So in addition to hiring more Black teachers and brown teachers as well, like Alyssa said, we can't toolkit our way toward ensuring that Black children reach their highest potential. We have to dismantle the deficit thinking that runs prevalent in our schools, and we have to replace it with an asset-based approach. We also must replace the Euro-centered curriculum with something that's more humanizing and grounded in the experiences and the wealth that's within the African-American community as well. So, my hopes and dreams for Michigan schools, given these protests, is for Black children and brown children to be able to reach their highest potential.
Yes, all the snaps. Dr. Carter Andrews, Dr. Dunn. follow up?
Well, I was thinking about a couple things, hopes and dreams for Michigan schools as a result of these protests. But I also think for all schools, like, first, I just want folks to call a thing a thing. Like, we still have a problem naming racism when it happens, right? Particularly white educators, but I think there are others who tiptoe around what's considered the elephant in the room. Ain't no elephant in the room. Like, it's up front and in our faces. We are being entertained by Black death through these viral videos. So call a thing and then address it and abolish it. At a very micro level, our language has to become more concrete and explicit if we're going to really have transformative solutions for not just Black and brown children, but for all traditionally and historically marginalized kids in schools. So that's one thing. And then as I think about Black children in general, I just want to go back to those three things I stated earlier. Like, I hope Michigan schools can get to a place where they really affirm Black students' humanity. I don't want to be negative, but I believe when Black children are seen through the white gaze and through white supremacist logics, they are still seen as 3/5 of a human, or furthermore, objects that have to be educated. And so I think we got to get to a place where we first affirm the humanity of Black bodies that are sitting in front of us. And secondly, sustain their joy. And I'm being intentional about saying sustain, because I believe Black babies come to school joyful. And there's something about schooling that robs them of that joy. Adrienne Wing calls that spirit injury, but Tina Love calls that spirit murder. I don't want to resign myself to murder, but I do believe Black children are constantly injured in the spirit by schools, sometimes intentionally and unintentionally. And then my last hope is that Michigan schools will cultivate the brilliance of Black children. Within that statement, there's an assumption that they come to school already brilliant. And how are you building on that brilliance to help them reach their maximum potential?
Ooh, okay. Well, I don't want to keep going last. So let me just say that I'm heartened by the steps that I see various school districts taking of divesting from police presence in schools, as East Lansing just did last night, ensuring that curricular offerings in their schools represent diverse perspectives and fostering community conversations about racial injustice. Like, this is all great, but if we really want to create the kind of systemic change that's needed, we need to revolutionize the way schools are funded. We need to invest in the schools and communities that have been historically disinvested in. We need to build pipelines of Black teachers. I believe that education is the cornerstone of change, but we've got work to do in other areas too: workplace, environment, healthcare, all of these things, all of these sectors of society need some attention, but schools are the foundation. If you would have asked me even a month ago if I felt like we would see meaningful change in my lifetime in terms of systemic racism, I would say maybe, doubtful. But if you ask me today, I would say that it depends on what people do in the next days and weeks and months. I'm saying that I'm cautious, but it's possible. That is my dream, but it depends on you all to stand up and demand that change. So come on, y'all. We're counting on you. We're counting on you. All right, Dr. Dunn.
Thank you. I agree. I think my hope is that our attention and our presence here is not temporary. I think for many people, it feels easier and more comfortable to be part of the movement now. Not easy and comfortable, period, but easier, with businesses and organizations and schools coming out with statements against racism and justice. I think it can feel like it's more widespread that folks are taking a stand. And as Dr. Carter Andrews has written about, often these statements are very surface level and not addressing the real issues, right? But what happens next month? What happens in August and September when schools start again in whatever form schools can look like now. What happens when it's not fashionable for liberally minded white people to post selfies at protests on social media? What happens when all the anti-racist books aren't sold out on Amazon and we actually have to read them? This is where the rubber meets the road. And I think that's why it's important to remember the words of Audre Lorde, that revolution is not a one-time event. And so in schools in Michigan and beyond, I hope that the current protests of police brutality and white supremacy will make way for seeing the connections to the racism and white supremacy that are already in schools, as my colleagues have mentioned: police and discipline policies, standardized testing, zero tolerance policies, a white-centric curriculum, tracking, and so much more. Because all of these things are bound up in ideologies of whiteness and need to be eliminated. Schools need to be thoroughly reimagined for liberation and justice, for joy and brilliance, as my colleagues are saying, for Black children. So my hope is that teachers and administrators listen to youth voices, listen to Black youth and youth of color, to aspiring co-conspirators and allies and accomplices in the fight for racial justice. And we got a question in the chat, whether these youth are in your schools or not, because they are telling us on social media, right? It doesn't matter if you have Black children in your school. We know what they're calling for. And honestly, let's just get out of the way and let them show us what freedom really looks like.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you, panelists. Such an enriching conversation. I'm all keyed up now. But I'd like to move on to some of the questions that were submitted by attendees in advance of our forum tonight. So each of our panelists will take on one or two from that list. We'll just see how time goes with this, but I want to try and get some live questions too. I'm not sure that we will, but we'll try. So if you submit a question, we're not able to answer it tonight, please be in contact with us, or better yet, stay tuned for additional events. The good news is that there's a lot of overlap in the questions that are being submitted. So even if your specific question isn't answered, hopefully you get the information that you're looking for from our panelist responses. Okay, so Dr. Carter Andrews, why don't you start us off? Share the question and then your thoughts in response, please.
Great. So one of the questions that was submitted was, I am one of 20 out of a staff of about 60 educators of color that work in my school. How do I educate my coworkers when they are promoting anti-Blackness in a school? What do I tell them? How do I approach them? So I think this is a great question. I think teachers of color experience this all the time. And as a former K-12 teacher of color myself, I thought about my experiences teaching and then my experiences as a teacher educator. And I'd say, first of all, call it out when it's happening, right? I think I've said this earlier. We all have to become comfortable with naming racism as it is in its various forms. Like, racism takes various forms when it happens, and you shut it down right there. But secondly, we have to understand it is not the job or burden of Black educators to raise the critical consciousness of their non-Black colleagues regarding racism. Like, we have been, I think Terah said this earlier, we've been doing that for years. So the whole thought of how do I educate my coworkers, I just want teachers of color to kind of lift that burden and stop shouldering it. There are a lot of conscious, critical allies, white and non-Black, in this work. And I think, as we've said a couple times here tonight, step up, like raise up and help your colleagues who are in your building raise their critical consciousness around racism, white supremacy, white privilege. And I think school leaders have to do the necessary homework to identify the anti-racist and consciousness-raising plan for their building. You're the leader, you're the captain of the ship, but don't do that work in isolation or with your predominantly white administrative team, right? But you also don't position the one or two educators or administrators of color that you have on staff to be the native informant, to school you on how to move the needle in your building or district. Racial justice work in education it really requires coalition building and collaboration with knowledge experts and truth tellers from across the community. So I think Terah said this earlier, like, schooling is a microcosm of the larger society. So as you engage this work, as you educate your colleagues, as you move forward with plans, you've got to involve young people, parents, guardians, teacher educators, healthcare professionals. So again, you know, in closing, I just want to say we have to give Black teachers and other educators of color the opportunity to not shoulder that burden, to educate white colleagues or non-Black colleagues. In the case of white colleagues, we actually recenter whiteness by continuing to educate them.
Yes. All right, Dr. Dunn, why don't you hit us with another question and your response to it, please?
Sure. Okay. We got a lot of questions in advance, and even though this event is for school leaders, we actually got a lot of questions from teachers. And so I wanted to highlight one so that our leaders can hear what their teachers are saying. So the submitted question is this: I have a fear of being reprimanded for discussing these real life events with my students. I fear that some teachers and administrators will see me telling the truth as bias. How do I combat this? And then there were others that were phrased very similarly. And I hear a lot of this from teachers about being perceived as biased or too political. But the thing, of course, is that all of education is political, and we can't avoid politics in education because education itself is a political enterprise, like all social systems. And we can't escape it, nor should we try. The curriculum we use, the textbook we use, if and how we deliver school lunches, police in schools, all of this is political. And further, we're all biased, implicitly or explicitly. So if someone is saying to you, you're biased because you want to teach for racial justice, well, then that person is likely biased the other way. So striving for an anti-racist classroom that dismantles whiteness and anti-Blackness is on the right side of history. It's the only way forward, biased or not. This should not be a partisan issue. This is a human rights issue. We have to do it anyway. And for white teachers wondering if and how to do this, it's important to remember, as Dr. Carter Andrews just said, that our Black colleagues of students and other people of color don't have the luxury of just deciding when and how to engage in this work. And we do have a choice, and we have to make the right one. So that means that you can find others in your school or online, in teacher inquiry or teacher action groups, in community groups and nonprofits who can fight with you. We know that there's more power in the collective, and you can use research-based evidence to justify what and why you're engaging in this type of pedagogy. There is plenty of it. There is so much of it, like just email and ask, seriously. And finally, I think we have to remember that the ultimate goal as educators is about empowering our students. This is not just about doing what we think is best for them as teachers. So it's about asking them, about working alongside them, and connecting with community activists so that you're not doing this work alone.
Great. Dr. Phelps-Moultrie?
Yeah, I'm going to start with something. I'm going to just briefly answer quickly because I think we've already answered it, but I want to kind of point out something here. But there's a question submitted that says, I'm a social studies teacher in a white, rural, hyper-conservative district with a long history of white supremacist activity. Social justice, anti-racist curriculum is often perceived as political and liberally biased. And with schools school of choice in Michigan, parent perceptions are important to admin. Well, firstly, all districts have a history of white supremacist activity, and these activities continue. So some of which we've already highlighted today. Secondly, I want to highlight that anti-Blackness, racism, white supremacy, and white violence stretch across to the liberal aisle too. I think a good way to kind of illustrate this is quoting from Malcolm X, who basically summarized the political fight against racism, white supremacy, that liberals and conservatives are just a faction of white people that are jockeying for power. So when one asks, how do we advance anti-racist curriculum with parents as allies in such a conservative area with polarized politics today, we progress by picking up that call to action. These polarized politics have always existed. They are not going away. And if we don't take drastic steps of becoming anti-racist, social justice oriented, and ridding ourselves of anti-Blackness, we all lose. And I think Alyssa pointed that out today. Currently our democracy just hangs in a balance, and it would be a grave mistake if we proceed by continuing to coddle to white supremacist beliefs, ignoring white violence for the sake of school choice dollars. So one thing that I wanted to kind of quote, or one person I want to quote who had just had an article that came out yesterday was Michelle Alexander. She's the author of New Jim Crow. She wrote an excellent op-ed piece in the New York Times yesterday, and I think it summarizes the response to this question. She says, "We find ourselves here for the same reasons a civil war tore our nation apart more than 100 years ago. Too many citizens prefer to cling to brutal and unjust systems than to give up political power. And these perceived benefits of white supremacy and an exploitative economic system, we can't keep continuing doing that. So if we do not learn the lessons of history and choose a radically different path forward, we may lose our chance at creating a truly inclusive democracy."
Excellent, thank you. So we have a few minutes left here, and so I'm gonna call an audible. Ooh, why am I making a sports metaphor? That is not okay. What we're gonna do is I'm gonna leave the panel. You all can see the Q&As also, right? Okay. So what I want to do is just leave it to the panelists to continue to just read a question and the response. It can be one of the pre-selected questions, or you can pull from the Q&A, and people won't necessarily know which of the questions coming from where, so it doesn't get confused. But I would rather let you all guide where you want to go with the last 5-6 minutes. Maybe each of us, or each of you, I won't go this round, can give a question again and your response. So whoever wants to go next.
Well, I see a question that's targeted around awareness, and it mirrored another question that was submitted to us earlier. So one question was asking, like, how do you bring awareness of community struggles to students of different communities? For example, how do I discuss the Black community struggle and explain it to students who are members of the Latinx or white community? And there's another question that's been submitted on the chat that talks about bringing awareness of these struggles to different groups and places. Firstly, I think before discussing Black struggle to others, there are a number of things that I suggest. I think many want to walk into Black spaces after these atrocities have occurred and without doing the work of understanding their own implicit bias and anti-Black assumptions. When that occurs, and we've already kind of said it, white folks often rebuild these spaces, drowning out Black voices and then leaving little room for proportionate and authentic stakeholdership. And they then become the power brokers in this space. There was a chat, somebody chatted this earlier, and I was just like, we are on the same page. There was a book, White Architects of Black Education by William Watkins that provides several exemplars of when it comes to the struggle of African Americans controlling their own education, that they end up not doing that because of that infiltration into their Black spaces. But if
Dr.
you,
Cesare Warren, who posted that
oh,
link.
you did that? Okay, go ahead. But if you are not actively doing the self-reflection work, learning about the wealth and assets and funds of knowledge within Black communities and dismantling one's own deficit thinking about Blackness, the work that you will do will gain no ground. Matter of fact, it probably will reinforce white supremacy because it's performative. It weaponizes whiteness even more. And so if we want to get to a point of bringing awareness, which I hope is rooted in really working in solidarity as an authentic ally, I want to take this opportunity to quote Terrence Green at UT Austin. He is the global thought leader and originator of community-based equity audits. And what he says is school leaders must recognize that students and community members have lived experiences which can provide significant information when strategizing about community concerns and how to address them, particularly as it concerns Black struggle. So concerns and how to address them should be constantly reinforced with the voices that you're talking about. It cannot exclude them. They have to be at their own table. You know, when people talk about, well, we invite them to the table, it needs to be at their own table. And so we can't wait for these moments where we're going to start doing that work and then shifting to how can I help with Black struggle. it also has to be embedded in our everyday practices as educational leaders. And so, you know, I understand this need to bring awareness, but I also think we have to begin trying to do it all the time, every day, and embed it in our everyday practices.
Awesome. Who wants to go next?
Alyssa, did you find one? I'm still reading them, but as Jada was, there's so many and they're so good. I think I'll make a general comment about, I see a theme around, you know, is this a linear process? Do I do critical self-reflection first and then act? No, ain't nobody got time for that. We need people to act now. Look, people of color been juggling critical self-reflection and acting for our whole lives. So white people, we need you to self-reflect and do something. And in your doing, know that you're going to misstep. As Alyssa said earlier, like she named 4. We can't give you a list of all the missteps. Your racial justice work is like loaded with missteps, but you got to misstep to grow. So while you're sitting back and reading a book and having, you know, your critical friends group, you also need to be in the work in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, right? So I just wanted to put that out there. But you can't, as somebody said earlier, jump to action and you're not self-reflecting. I'm not white, right? But like to spend a lifetime trying to interrogate your whiteness, like I'm gonna let Alyssa take that. So you can't go to action and you're not self-reflecting. We are all immersed in an imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, as Bell Hooks said. People who are systematically oppressed know what that feels like. People who are on the advantaged end of that don't. So you got to really do some deep excavation to understand that while you are working in solidarity. It's a both and, not a first and then second.
Absolutely. Dr. Dunn.
I can take another question or we can do the closing. What would you prefer? I'm good with either, whatever.
Yeah, well, we started a little after 7, so I think we have a little time.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it. I think
Okay.
people are here for it. They're okay if we go a little,
All right.
beyond,
let's go.
right?
Let's go.
Let's do it.
Okay, so there are a lot of questions that were submitted in advance and that are popping up in the Q&A around a similar theme. And that's about talking with young children about the protests and about being anti-racist, especially in white schools. How do we do this as white teachers? And then about resources. So I think that's what I'll talk a little bit about. So thinking about how do we help our young children understand what's happening and take ownership in this fight to be anti-racist. I think that anyone who is a parent or an educator, we know that children know and see and can understand so much more than we give them credit for. And all children can and should learn about these protests within the context of the ongoing struggle for justice and equity that my colleagues referenced at the beginning of the session. And we know that we can't rely on school curriculum and textbooks to do this. So, because those just reinforce white supremacy in many cases, right? They silence people implicitly and explicitly. And so that means that as school leaders and as teachers, that you're gonna have to find a lot of your own resources. And luckily there are a lot of them. There always have been a lot of them, and there's even more now. I think it's really important for our students to see us modeling the learning process as they become emerging activists. They have to see us asking questions, highlighting and amplifying the voices of Black authors and activists, and not just in February, and giving them the space to, as Dr. Bettina Love writes, to freedom dream about what they want their futures to look like. And they need to see you being in the community and being with the community. So I'm gonna, in the chat, a lot of people are asking for resources. So I'm gonna put in a few links at the bottom of the page for you to get started with. And then in each of those kind of spaces, it leads you to more articles that you can read to get you going. And as Dr. Carter Andrews says, that is happening at the same time as you're taking other direct action.
Awesome. I'm going to throw a bonus in here from someone who asked, you know, I don't know exactly what the question is because it was in the chat, and I'm rewarding someone who put a question in the chat when I said not to do that, but that's okay. Someone who said, what's the role of higher education in getting the research to the K-12 communities? That's a challenge. Yes, there's research, but we're not reading research journals. Listen, it is a challenge, and we are pushing our colleagues every day to make their research relevant, but it's not the one, that's not us on the panel. We are here doing this forum, right? Because we want to translate the research that we're doing into these more accessible spaces. Dorinda's, you know, working on her, got the piece out in Ed Week last week that's very accessible. Alyssa Hadley Dunn, I'm going to shout it out again, has the most tremendous Facebook group called Teaching on Days After. Tell me what it is exactly so the people can find it. Teaching on Days After?
Yeah, Teaching on Days After. I just linked it. Thank you.
Oh, yes. It is a powerful list of resources, right? Dr. Phelps-Moultrie is at every community event that you can imagine. She is doing the work. So I know that this question is not directed to us, but we are pushing our colleagues to do this as well, right? And I'm calling out everybody, right? Everybody is called up to do this. This is not just this person's responsibility, not just those people over there. It's going to take everybody, y'all. It's going to take everybody. So, but I appreciate the question about this is not just the ivory tower kind of conversation where we publish in peer-reviewed, you know, empirical articles and journals or whatever. This is relevant and critical information that needs to be coming out now. So I appreciate the push, and we're pushing too. Don't worry, we're pushing too. We're pushing our colleagues who want to just, anyways, I'm not gonna stop. Okay, so I'm shocked. The hour has gone by so quickly. And you know, I get to talk with my colleagues on this panel here pretty often, but in forums like these, I'm reminded of just how brilliant they are. And so I want to just offer an opportunity if anyone wants to give any brief closing thoughts before we roll out here.
You know, I was just going to say, this really is the time, I think, for intentional coalition building between districts, community members, community organizers, and higher ed institutions. The work is so multi-layered and vast in schools. I'm just talking about in schools. And, you know, if you're going to have an educational agenda that is designed to demolish systemic racism, it has to center the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And it has to center on not just the problems, but again, humanity, wholeness, and thriving, right? And part of that is about what those things look like in the structure as it is, because we can't demolish it overnight, but it's also freedom dreaming and reimagining what schooling could be if it were not constructed in the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy that we all live under in the US. So just intentional coalition building, reach out to communities of color as you think about anti-racist praxis and policy reform and practice and curricular reform. White people can't do that work by themselves. Even if you're in a predominantly white school district, you have got to reach out to experts in communities of color.
Yes, Alyssa, Jada.
Well, just to kind of throw out some practical application to coalition building as well from the leadership frame. When you find those overlapping spaces for school and community, that's a space where you can do that. When you when you become a servant leader, where you feel like you are obligated, it is your job, and that's what we all are striving to do as leaders, to serve stakeholders. That's an opportunity to do coalition building. When you build positive relationships with your community. That's an opportunity to do that coalition building. And when you connect directly with students, that's someplace I feel like I wish we had more time to kind of think through that. That's an opportunity to do coalition building. So, you know, let this be our moment. If you haven't taken steps already, then there should be nothing stopping you. And so, you know, I'm just honored that you have asked me here today. I'm, you know, so touched that there's so many people who want this knowledge. You know, so reach out to us, you know, reach out to the College of Education, because we are here in this fight with you. We have children in these schools with you. And so, you know, we can say we're all in this together as educators. I truly believe that.
Awesome. Dr. Dunn?
Thank you. I just want to echo those comments and say to everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking this action step. If even if it was your first, please don't let it be your last, because lives are literally depending on it. Thank you.
Amazing. So I've obviously been thinking about this word responsibility. And so calling this forum Rising to Our Responsibility was intentional. And I hope that responsibility is sitting on you heavy as you leave this conversation tonight, because here's the reality. Dr. Carter Andrews, Dr. Dunn, Dr. Phelps-Moultrie, many other scholars have been doing this work for some time. None of what's happening right now in the world is news to us. It's not a surprise. What's new, what's surprising is, and encouraging, is that there's this awareness in the world right now, right? It's that you all have been awakened in this way. This is wonderful. But what happens next, as I said before, what happens next in this revolution literally depends on what you do next. If you put out a statement in support of Black students, that's great. That's a wonderful first step. But what are the concrete actions that you're going to take to support those words? It's your responsibility to take action, to listen to Black and brown families in your schools and districts, to undertake continued learning about these issues. You came to the forum tonight. That's a great action step. You need to interrogate your own racial identity and the role that it plays in who you are and how you navigate this world. You need to commit to hiring more Black and brown teachers and administrators, but also creating a culture where your current minoritized staff members feel an authentic sense of belonging and community. You have a responsibility to ensure that your curriculum is reflective of the world, the real history, not the washed out version that maybe you've been taught when you were in school. Many of you indicated in your submissions that you're the only one in your school, in your district, fighting for racial justice. I'm gonna tell you that you're not. Find allies, build coalitions, and if you really are the only one, I promise that your presence, your voice will still matter for all of the students, all of the families in the district that you're in who are yearning for change. Fighting racial justice matters regardless of your context. It matters, it's relevant whether you're in a suburban district, an urban district, a rural district. It matters whether your school is predominantly Black or whether there's only a handful of Black students in your classes. The events and the protests that we're witnessing right now remind us that we are preparing our students for a global stage, right? And so I'm going to ask you all on this call, how are you going to rise to that responsibility? As a Black mother of a Black son, I'm counting on you. I'm counting on you to make this change. Lord, I'm gonna just lose it right now. But I want to thank our panelists, everyone who attended this session. I want to thank the behind the scenes people, Jen Brown and Lauren Knapp and Nicole Geary, who have helped us put all the technology together and get this together. Also Dean Floden for his support of these events. I want you to keep in contact with us. We will let you know about future sessions. I'm trying to get back into, like, you know, what's the next step, Terah? And really, I just want to cry. So we will keep you posted, right? This is the first of a series of conversations we want to lead with you all, but please be inspired to change. Take a step, take any step, right? You can do this, y'all. We're counting on you. You can do this. Anyways, thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you all.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you all.
Yeah.
My colleagues are so smart.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
We're slowly leaving.
I know, I'm seeing the numbers go down.
Thanks
Are we-
for joining
Bye.
us.
I know. I don't want to leave them. I feel like they're my
I
babies.
know, until the last one is gone.
Yeah, we're gonna stay.
We're gonna
Yeah, I
stay.
mean, we're gonna stay and clean up the cups and sweep up and like all the things like if we were really
We're gonna
doing,
wipe down the table.
put the chairs back, if we were really doing this, I'm like, we'd
Turn
be
the lights off.
in the high school auditorium on the stage.
Yep. Last one out of the building.
Put the lights off. You don't just get to like finish your comments and go.
I know.
Right.
World.
You don't have to go home.
But you can't stay.
Stay on this Zoom.
You can't stay in the Zoom.
You can't stay in the Zoom. Jen, you can stop recording now.